it's definitely inevitable that we are at the point that we are now at. Months ago, beginning in Genesis 1, moving on to Genesis 2, the themes therein from Genesis 1, the themes therein from Genesis 2, moving into the themes of Genesis 3, really dissecting those characters. And although there is a lot more to dissect, for the context of justification, just highlighting what relates and what is supposed to relate to the overall scope, to the overall point, to the overall definition of the term justification. And recently, the serpent has been subject, and recently, Satan has been the subject, looking at these terms and how they apply and seeing how they fit into the character of a Balaam and seeing how that Balaam moves, seeing how all of these things play their part and have played their part in generational ecclesiastical history to make that woman do what is contrary to the philosophy of the chosen mind for the purpose of establishing the image of God therein, or the philosophy of righteousness by religious law therein, subtly. And so it's inevitable that we would get to the point, and I'm definitely skipping ahead here, but we would get to the point of their consequence. Sure, it would be that should they do this, they would die the death. And of course, that death wasn't a literal death. That death was philosophical. That death was devotional. What got introduced into the religious world was the concept of good and evil. What got introduced into the religious world of the Adam therein was the concept of good and evil. Yet going further down, they were ejected. They were put out of that garden as a consequence of their behavior. Just reading Genesis 3:22-24. Genesis 3:22-24, and it reads, "And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life." Now, we're going to look at what this cherubim is. What are cherubims? We're going to look at this flaming sword. What is the flaming sword? Because sure, they died the death, and that was the consequence of their negligence. But the ultimate consequence of their negligence was the stoppage of the flow of the philosophy of life, of quote-unquote life, by cherubims, and by flaming sword. What does this mean? And when we think of cherubim, we have an idea. It may not be whatever is in the Bible, but we have an idea of what it is. And it may be what is in the Bible. But when we think of cherubim, the first mention, although here it's Exodus 25:18-19, not really the first mention, but a consistent mention in Exodus 25 and in the Exodus as a whole, the book. But just pulling from Exodus 25:18-19 here, "Thou shalt make 2 cherubims of gold, of beaten work shalt thou make them in the 2 ends of the mercy seat, and make 1 cherub on the one end and the other cherub on the other end. Even of the mercy seat shall you make the cherubims on the 2 ends thereof." Now this is what was placed. Remember, we're not dealing with the literal garden here, but for the sake of the language, we've gone through the context. What is to guard, what was placed to guard that way of quote-unquote life was cherubims, was these things here. Now, these are not actual entities. What's going on here is that this is wood carved up into the image of something. Instrument carved up into the image of something and overlaid with something else. That's as far as to the extent of a cherubim goes, unless you enter into some sort of vision. Now, before getting into the vision side of things, because you can only see cherub or cherubims, whether if it's not some sort of carved up thing overlaid with something else of a material context, it's in some sort of vision. So before we're going to see a vision, let's just get to the root word of cherub, cherubim. Let's see what it means and what it's supposed to mean to us as we're hearing it. Now, cherub, a cherub or imaginary figure. Now, in reality, cherubims, they don't actually exist. They're not real. In no plane of existence do they exist. They are imaginary figures. Let's go into a vision and see. Ezekiel 10 and 1. Ezekiel chapter 10 and verse 1. Then I looked, and behold, in the firmament that was above the head of the cherubims, there appeared over them as it were a sapphire stone, as the appearance of the likeness of a throne. Now, Ezekiel here is in vision, and he's seeing a lot. He's seeing some creatures, and above the creatures is a surface, and above that surface is a throne. Now, that throne there that exists is sitting on a surface that there exists. All of this is in vision, existing in vision. Underneath that throne and underneath that surface, the author writing the book of Ezekiel lets us know that what is under these things, they are called cherubims. Now, what do these cherubims look like? Ezekiel 1, 5 through 8. Ezekiel 1, 5 through 8. Also out of the midst thereof came the likeness of 4 living creatures. This was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man. Everyone had 4 faces, and everyone had 4 wings. And their feet were straight feet, and the sole of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot. And they sparkled like the color of brandished brass. And they had the hands of a man under their wings on their 4 sides. And they 4 had their faces and their wings. So this is an imaginary creature. And did this imaginary creature look like the same creature that was carved up onto the top of that covenant box, that ark? Who knows? But this is an imaginary creature. This is a creature created from image, whether created by hand from image or created by mind from image. This is not a literal thing. 1 Kings 6, 23 to 28. The king here. 1 Kings 6, 23 to 28. And within the oracle he made 2 cherubims of olive tree, each 10 cubits high. And 5 cubits was the one wing of the cherub, and 5 cubits the other wing of the cherub. From the uttermost part of the one wing unto the uttermost part of the other were 10 cubits, and the other cherub was 10 cubits. Both the cherubims were of one measure and one size. The height of the one cherub was 10 cubits, and so was it of the other cherub. And he set the cherubims within the inner house, and they stretched forth the wings of the cherubims, so that the wing of the one touched the one wall, and the wing of the other cherub touched the other wall. And their wings touched one another in the midst of the house, and he overlaid the cherubims with gold. Now, I understand that when I'm reading this, the author writing this is repeating themselves. You can hear me repeating the things that are going on here. Constantly repeating that this was 10 cubits, constantly repeating that this was overlaid in gold. The literary context of what the author's trying to do, they're trying to let their reader know that what they are overlaying and doing, it's fake. The constant repeating and enlarging is to emphasize the nature of what's going on here. The nature of what's going on here is that these cherubims, these are images. These are images created in the likeness of something that has a height of whatever it will be, overlaid in whatever it should, according to the one that is crafting it. That's the extent to where this goes. So, knowing that the cherub or the cherubim is an imaginary figure, cherubims are strictly to the imagination, strictly to the vision. When placing that into the context of what was placed at the east of that garden, what does that actually mean or translate to?
Knowing Bible is a course for learners wanting to grow closer to themselves and to their Creator. There is a reason why we trust the Bible. There is a reason why the Bible moves us to celebrate it. There is also a reason why we feel hesitant to let the Bible's words satisfy us. Traditional religious theory isn't always satisfactory. Carrying a belief without proof will soon aggravate our thoughts and feelings. Knowing Bible is a course that is designed to wake us up to who and what our belief is. Knowing Bible is for learners that want a living experience beyond conventional religion. Don't let this educational opportunity slip away from you.
When we place all of that into the context of what was established at the east of the garden, cherubims were placed at the east of the garden to guard the way of quote-unquote life. When we're thinking cherubims, we shouldn't be thinking these four-headed creatures. We shouldn't be thinking maybe these one-headed creatures with long wings. This is a term here. The term is to be understood as it is. Imaginary figures. What was placed at the east of the garden, this is not again a literal garden. What was placed at the east of that garden was imaginary figures. Imaginary figures, imaginary likenesses, imaginary images were constructed to guard the way to the tree of life. But that's not the only thing. Imaginary figures were not the only thing given to keep and to guard the way of quote-unquote life. It was also the flaming sword. So, what is the flaming sword? What is the flaming sword? Looking at Deuteronomy 32, 39 to 41. Looking at Deuteronomy 32, 39 to 41. Deuteronomy 32, 39 to 41, it reads, "See now that I, even I, am He, and there is no God with me. I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal. Neither is there any that can deliver out of my hand. For I lift up my hand to heaven and say, I live forever. If I whet my glittering sword, and mine hand take hold on judgment, I will render vengeance to mine enemies, and will reward them that hate me." Another term for flaming in the Bible's context is glittering. Another term for flaming in this context within the Bible is glittering. The flaming sword is a glittering sword. Now, what's interesting with this is that the flaming sword, the glittering sword, it's held by a figure. The flaming sword and the glittering sword is held by a figure. Looking at Nahum. Nahum 3, 1 through 3. Nahum 3, 1 through 3 reads, "Woe to the bloody city, it is all full of lies and robbery. The prey departeth not. The noise of a whip, and the noise of the rattling of the wheels, and of the prancing horses, and of the jumping chariots. The horseman lifteth up both the bright sword and the glittering spear." And then the verse goes on to talk about the woes of that city. The horseman. I'm pointing these verses out to show that the horseman lifts up both the bright sword and the glittering spear. The flaming sword, the glittering sword, the bright sword, the glittering spear, they're all the same thing. So what is actually that flaming sword is not actually a singular, as we would like to imagine, sword, a singular sword spinning around in a circle. That flaming sword is actually a horseman. Now, this is interesting once more, because when you take horseman and you look at the term, you get an interesting conclusion. What does horseman mean to the Hebrew? the very first term that pops up is Baal. B-A-A-L, Baal. Master, husband, archer, captain, chief man, lord, horseman, husband. The one thing that pops up for horseman is Baal. What was placed at the east of that garden, what was placed at the east of that garden to make sure the way of quote-unquote life is not disturbed, are imaginary figures and a Baal. Imaginary figures and a Baal was placed to protect the way to the tree of life. The flaming sword is a glittering sword. The flaming sword is a glittering sword. It is held by the horseman. The horseman can be understood as a Baal, a lord, a master, a captain. What was placed at the east of that garden was not literal imaginary cherubim as we can imagine or would want to. It was not placed a large sword spinning in every direction or whatever we may want to think about that. What was placed at the east of that garden was imaginary figures. Keep the term as simple as possible. Cherubims equal imaginary figures. What was placed at the east of the garden were imaginary figures. And the flaming sword translates to be a horseman or a Baal or a lord or a captain. To get a better illustration of just what this means and to just have a picture, looking at Joshua 5:13-15. Joshua 5:13-15 reads, "And it came to pass, when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his what drawn? With his sword drawn in his hand. Joshua went to him, said, Art thou for us or for our adversaries? He said, Nay, but as what of the Lord of the host? He said, Nay, but as captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and did worship, and said unto him, What saith my Lord unto his servant?" Not Lord as in capital L-O-R-D. This is lowercase l-O-R-D. "What saith my Lord unto his servant? The captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, He said, Loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for the place whereon thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so." Now, I'm pointing this out here because we can easily substitute that flaming sword, which is held by the horseman, which horseman is a Baal or a lord. We can easily substitute, or a captain. We can easily substitute that flaming sword for the figure that we see here. The figure that we see here in this verse, we can substitute for that flaming sword. Now, this figure that we're substituting for that flaming sword, I'm not saying that there was a angel of the Lord at the garden or there was some protecting angel. The Genesis narrative, especially 1, 2, and 3, they are figurative. Nothing is real here. Nothing's real. This is all parable. This is all illustration. This is figurative illustration for concrete meaning within and beneath. What was placed at the east of that garden was imaginary figures alongside a captain of the Lord's host. What was placed at the east of that garden was imaginary figures and a Baal of the host. What was placed at that east of the garden was imaginary images with a Lord. Now, when we think about this, and all of this is used as figurative illustration to denote a very, very, very blatant point. The philosophy of life is a philosophy of regeneration, regenerating the conversations, thoughts, feelings, actions, and behaviors from the prior experience that it had, which prior experience is in the image of God, which image is righteousness by religious law. The manner of life, the philosophy of life, is regenerating the conversation from exhibiting, demonstrating, and experiencing a spirituality, a philosophical culture, inward and mental, by religious law. When you are living by the manner of quote-unquote life, your personal and your devotional conversation is resurrecting from experiences where habit and routine are guiding the heart and are the foundation of movement for the body and for the mind. The manner of life is a philosophical wisdom whereby the regeneration of the inward parts leads to wisdom to be exercised and continually exercised for the perfecting of what is within. What's hiding this routine? What's keeping this routine guard are imaginary figures and a Baal.
We are to have, as is said and believed when it comes to life and religion, faith. But when it comes to exercising faith, a very crucial aspect of having and exercising faith isn't mentioned. In order to have faith in anything, we need to know what we would have faith in. This book looks into how the Bible defines the process of justification. We are supposed to know what we believe. Personal knowledge will bring life to our experience with the Bible. Get justification to know how to safely take care of your faith.
The author of the book of Genesis is letting their reader know something very crucial. The author of the book of Genesis is letting their reader know something very crucial. They're letting their reader know that as a consequence of the actions of Adam, of that assembly or of assemblies in general, because this episode in Genesis is not singular, it's not solitary. This is a recurring experience the author of the book of Genesis is giving us. Because of this behavior demonstrated, the consequence is the covering up of the philosophy of well-being with imaginary figures and a Baal. That's the consequence. And this type of covering up, mindful to think of 2 Corinthians 3:12 and 13. 2 Corinthians 3:12 and 13. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 and 13, where it says, "Seeing that we have such hope, we use great plainness of speech, and not as Moses, which put a veil over his face, that the children of Israel could not steadfastly look to the end of that which is abolished." Now, what is to keep the way to the tree of life are imaginary figures and a Baal. A veil is put over the form of the tree of life. This veil that is put over the form of the tree of life is a veil that appears in the form of imaginary images and a Lord. Both are imaginary. Both are imaginary. What is protecting the philosophy of quote-unquote life are imaginary figures joined to a Lord. In every single generation, what remains the same is that the philosophy contained within the scriptures is hidden and kept veiled by imaginary images and a Baal. When you think of Baal, what do you think of? Previous episode, we just read about something concerning Baal. The one that defended heaven, cast down Yam to hell. It's the same story repeated generation and generation over and over again. When you think of Baal, you can't have Baal without a dying and rising deity, because that's Baal. Baal is a dying and rising deity. When you think of Baal, you can't have Baal without the sun, because Baal represented the life form, the heart, the center, the image of the sun was Baal, the sun god. This is a recurring pattern going on within the religious world. Every single generation has the philosophy of life within the scriptures, hidden by imaginary figures joined by a Baal. Author of the book of Genesis knows this. author of the book of Genesis knows this. And they are writing ecclesiastical history for certain readers to understand what to stay away from and what to be aware of. When you're reading the book of Genesis, you're not reading anything literal. You're reading everything philosophical and context matters. The author of the book of Genesis is carefully crafting and weaving together a narrative explaining how the religious world works. And if you can catch on to how the religious world works, you can catch on to what you need not fall prey to. If you want to understand the code of quote-unquote life within the scriptures, you have to be able to get past and go beyond the imaginary figures and the Baal that is set up before it. The veil covering life, the philosophy of life, is imaginary images in a Baal. That's the consequence for their behavior. That's the consequence of the behavior of, in every generation, the chosen garden violating the mind of their philosophy therein. It will always be that imaginary figures joined to a Baal are covering the philosophy of life. If we can catch on to this, as the author of the book of Genesis is letting us catch on to it, we should be fine.